how authors were read in their own times and by the immediate generations that followed, whose reading and adaptation and extension and application of earlier thinkers gave rise to the modern world in which we find ourselves. And if we succeed, we should observe and understand more deeply nothing less than the birth of the modern mind. The intellectual revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries was profound in its consequences for the human condition, far more so than any political or social revolution of that period of European history that historians label the early modern period. And that intellectual revolution itself contributed crucially to revolutions in European life. Think upon it this way. If a culture changes the way that it thinks about truth, about nature, about the knowable, about the possible and the impossible, about the causes of things, about what it may have mastery over and what it must be fatalistic in the face of, that culture will alter its expectations and behavior in almost all areas of human life. If a culture changes the way it thinks about using mind properly, what's persuasive? How do you know something? How do you distinguish between ignorance and a human conquest in the world of knowledge? It changes the way it thinks about everything. A conceptual transformation is not contained to areas of thought alone. For example, one of the most dramatic changes that we are going to observe in the course of these 24 lectures is a transformation in the European attitude toward received intellectual authority. The breaking down of the notion with which the 17th century begins of the presumptive authority of the past. But to change one's evaluation of inherited intellectual authority is to change one's whole attitude toward authority in general, to the weight of the past in general. If one of the principles that holds you to the old astronomy, for example, is not astronomical reasoning, but above all the sense that the past is presumptively right, that tradition is presumptively right, and you change your thinking about astronomy or about how one recognizes the truth in a manner that no longer makes sacred the authority of the past, then you change your whole attitude to authority in general. If there is not presumptive intellectual authority, if the past was wrong in your view about the most crucial questions of human knowledge, reality, causality, and possibility, then what makes it right about political structure, about social structure, about economic transactions, about the possibilities of organized human life. This occurs in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, and we are the heirs of that transformation, perhaps the most dramatic transformation that has occurred in all of human history. Our course will look at the 17th and the 18th centuries. The 17th century was the scene of a conceptual revolution that is often very philosophical, very abstract, thinking formally about ontology and causality and epistemology. But it initiates a struggle for who shall be the teachers of a civilization, the bearers of the authority of the past, or thinkers with dramatic new ways of understanding the reality in which we find ourselves. And it will initiate a struggle over what lessons shall be taught to the minds, and above all, the educated minds of European civilization. In the 18th century, that conceptual revolution of the 17th century will become a revolution in culture, marked by the popularization of the conceptual revolution of the 17th century, its translation into easily accessible and popular forms, and marked also by an extension of its consequences to new areas of human thought and activity. Let's take one brief example to understand how deep the issue of conceptual change can be. In the inherited system of the 17th century, to which we'll turn in our next lecture, the things of this earth, the things of this nature below the heavens, were deemed to be radically imperfect things, so often far removed, we shall see, from the perfection of God. In the course of the intellectual revolution of the 17th century, above all what we call the scientific revolution, the 17th century will come to believe that the laws of nature that in its sense of things it has discovered are orderly and wondrous, and that they reflect the design, the intentions, the wisdom, the providence of God. Once that happens, the most commonplace observation about human beings, that we seek pleasure and flee pain, an observation often used to condemn us as selfish and immoral creatures, now comes to be understood as a mechanism of nature, but mechanisms of nature come to be understood as reflections of the will and providence of God. Well, if it's a law of nature that we seek happiness and flee pain, what follows? To give you a sense of how dramatic that is, one sentence you all know well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these, ... the pursuit of happiness. Among other things in this course, we shall discover how the intellectual revolution of the 17th century produced that dramatic change in the expectations about human life in the 18th century. So the thinking group is small. In a subsistence economy, very few are freed from labor to study and to think. But travel is expensive and dangerous, paintings few, there are no media, and one's window on other times, places, and minds. One escape from one's own life is the text, the book. And people who could read focused on the book with an intensity difficult to imagine today. They loved close reading and logical argument and took pride in erudition and formal thought. That will be our window onto early modern culture. Their texts and the debates around those texts, and dramatically the consequences of those debates. Thank you very much.